Welcome back to the Infinite Jungle. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the main takeaways of all core developers consensus call number 151. We're going to start off with some Pectra updates as per usual, and then we're going to talk about two new EIPs that developers agreed to finalize on the call. But before we get started with the show, here is a quick show disclaimer. I need to remind you to please refer to the disclaimer linked in the podcast show notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice, an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. The first Pectra public testnet upgrade is scheduled for activation on Monday, February 24th. It is scheduled for activation at 21:55 UTC, which for people who are in New York on the East Coast of the US, that is 4:55 p.m. ET. And for those of you that are on the West Coast of the States or North America, it's 1:55 p.m. PT. So those are the only two time zones that I'm going to share because those are the only two time zones that are relevant, at least to me. But the Holesky Pectra upgrade is scheduled for activation in just a few days. And by the time this recording goes out, the upgrade will have already happened. So please do tune in next week because our show for the Infinite Jungle next week, we'll talk about how that first Pectra testnet upgrade went. On the latest developer call, there were some concerns that developers may want to do additional testing before moving ahead with the Holesky upgrade. This is because there were a couple of bugs discovered in the Prism consensus layer client related to their implementation of EIP 7549, which deals with the aggregation of validator attestations. And there were concerns that every single client team has implemented this EIP slightly differently, and that might cause issues on the Ethereum network. But developers were confident that if they move forward with the Holesky testnet and do shadow forks, which are short-lived testnets that mimic the activity of existing networks, that they'd be able to catch these bugs. And a lot of developers, well, maybe I shouldn't say a lot of developers, but the collective kind of sentiment of the call was that testnets are for catching bugs. So rather than hold back and do another Pectra DevNet, developers decided to move ahead despite kind of the bugs that they recently discovered in the Prism client on Pectra DevNet 6, I believe, and just move forward with the Holesky public testnet upgrade. And after all, again, what are testnets for? I will note that this particular testnet upgrade, the Holesky testnet, will be the most public so far of all the testnets, all the testing that has happened for Pectra. Up until now, the testing that has happened for Pectra have largely been on private devnets. There was that one public testnet for Pectra that went live around the time of DevCon last year, but this is testing out code for Pectra that is close to being finalized. And because it is an official kind of Ethereum public testnet, it won't be a great look for Ethereum if there are major bugs discovered in code. But again, developers are very confident that they've already done several iterations, battle tested the code quite a bit. So any bugs discovered should probably be minor, and there will still be more testing, more testnets still to come. Because after Holesky, Ethereum developers still have the Sepolia testnet to look forward to. So that is the Pectra updates for today's episode. Developers did also share a few updates regarding PeerDAS development. However, I'm not going to go into those on this episode. Most of the updates that were shared on PeerDAS are actually going to be shared again on next week's ACDE call. So if you're interested in getting the latest on that, please do check out the full call write-up, which will be linked in today's show notes. Let's talk about the two new EIPs developers agreed to finalize on this week's call. Developers, these two EIPs are not EIPs that require a hard fork for developers to implement. So before people are like, oh my gosh, two new EIPs into Pectra this late in the game, these two new EIPs are one of them, developers and client teams can implement the EIP asynchronously. So it doesn't all have to happen all at once through a hard fork. And the other EIP is more an informational EIP, an EIP that documents the hardware requirements for Ethereum validators. So it doesn't change anything about the Ethereum code base. But they are still EIPs that will live on in the official EIP, Ethereum EIP repo, and will be merged into the Ethereum GitHub, the official Ethereum GitHub. So these two EIPs are not EIPs that are major code changes that change major aspects of the Ethereum protocol, but they have gone through the informal governance process of Ethereum and are now both in a stage of finalization where they'll be merged officially to the Ethereum GitHub repository. So it's worth talking about as they'll live on as official EIP documents. So the first EIP is EIP 7872. This EIP is a code change that will allow resource constrained validators to configure their own blob limits. There is a target number for the amount of blobs that can be included into a block and a maximum threshold for the maximum number of blob transactions that can be included in a block. These blobs were introduced through the Denkun upgrade of Ethereum. And these blobs are quite heavy. They're really these transactions that carry a ton of data with them because they contained batched transaction data from rollups and layer twos. Blobs were specifically introduced on Ethereum to help scale Ethereum as a data availability layer. And this EIP, EIP 7872, max blob flag for local builders, allows validators that are being run on local hardware on a laptop or a computer at home with limited bandwidth, limited resources to be able to configure blob limits that are lower than what the network is setting. So if the network is setting, a maximum or a target of 6 blobs per block, then a local builder can set up this flag and configure their blocks such that they only include, say, 2 blobs in a block, or however many that they're able to create or able to include into a block, because downloading these blobs and uploading them takes time. And if a validator doesn't have enough resources to be able to include all of the blobs and all of the blocks that the network sets, then there is the potential for that validator to miss their block proposal. So if there is not enough resources for the validator to be able to package in all of the blobs that the network is suggesting or allows, then validators that are running on these resource constrained devices can set up this flag and start to configure blocks that are less weighty, that are a little bit easier to propagate through the network, less heavy, meaning there's less data. Less data contained in them. And one of the pushbacks to the EIP that was shared on the call, Prism developer POTUS noted that the requirements, the bandwidth requirements, and also the heaviness of blobs will change drastically with the upcoming code change of PeerDAS. PeerDAS introduces a sampling mechanism so that validators don't have to download the full data of blobs. They can sample the data in blobs to ensure that all of the data that a rollup committed to Ethereum is actually there, has actually been posted to Ethereum. So there was a question of, how long this flag would really be useful for. But because developers are actively working on PeerDAS and PeerDAS is not going to be ready, say, in the next couple of months, there is still a window in which this flag could really help and have impact on validators running on resource constrained devices now. So the EIP author Kevandri, but in short, Kev. I hear his name being called Kev on the call, so I'm just going to say that. Kev proposed finalizing this EIP and having it implemented by client teams in their next releases. So Kev said he'll follow up with the EL client teams about their status and their timeline for implementing this flag. And again, this is a flag that client teams can set on their own. It doesn't require a hard fork. And there were no objections to finalizing this cool, neat little tool for local builders. The second EIP that developers also agreed to finalize on the call is EIP 7870. This one is a little bit more contentious, and this is an EIP that we've actually talked about before. Although I believe in the prior Infinite Jungle episode, I didn't say the EIP number. This EIP I discussed with Nixo and Yorick on a prior Infinite Jungle episode. I'll link to that episode in the show notes as well if you're curious to hear that conversation. This EIP is an EIP that sets the hardware and bandwidth recommendations for Ethereum validators and full nodes. This document is, again, an informational document, so it doesn't change anything about the Ethereum protocol. It creates a baseline for what the computational resources and hardware requirements are for an Ethereum validator that developers can use to more concretely see and measure how code changes will impact the hardware and it will impact the validators of the network because they now have a more concrete understanding of what kind of hardware validator node operators are running and operating. There were quite a bit of recommendations and also iterations that this document went through. So one of the recommendations that the EF protocol support team member Nixo shared about the CIP is that for the recommendations of how much it costs to operate an Ethereum validator, these costs should be based on it shouldn't be a static like USD dollar amount, but it should be a cost that is based on how long it takes for a validator to recoup the costs of their hardware. So if it takes a bit, depending on how much validators can earn from the network, adjusting the recommendations such that a validator who is buying the recommended hardware from this document can make up those costs within, say, 6 to 12 months. So it does require a bit of calculation, but it just kind of ensures that the document doesn't go out of date very quickly if there's a ton of dollar inflation or if the cost of hardware changes drastically. One of the pushbacks to what Nixo was saying, though, was shared by Ethereum Foundation researcher Dankred Feist. And Dankred was saying that it is the document shouldn't be making any assumptions about the profitability of validators over time. And he was saying that this is primarily due to liquid staking solutions. And the fact that liquid staking solutions are going to drive the return and the rewards that validators can earn close to zero, or I should say the rewards that people that are staking their ETH close to zero. Because if you imagine a future where almost the entirety of the ETH supply is staked, because the costs of staking are so low, you have a liquid token representation. Usually the barrier to entry or the reason why many people wouldn't want to stake their ETH is because it locks up your capital. It locks up the token. But through the rise of liquid staking solutions like Lido, that cost for staking is completely removed. So Dankred said, quote, "If you have enough liquidity, then at some point people might be happy to even stake for just 0.5% returns. It's not something that will happen immediately, but in 5 to 10 years, you can imagine that happens," end quote. So his point was that the document really should just he would rather the document just specify a dollar amount, a USD value for operating costs of a validator. And Nixo had a little bit of a spicy retort to this when she said that she wasn't aware that developers were planning and optimizing for a state where nearly all ETH supply becomes staked, because this harps back to ongoing discussions in the Ethereum community about how to stop the growth of liquid staking solutions and how to adjust the issuance of Ethereum such that Ethereum doesn't continue to move toward a future where 100% or close to 100% of ETH supply ends up becoming staked. But that aside, most of the developers on the call, I think, were either didn't have an opinion about this or were just fine moving ahead with a USD amount for the hardware costs. And Kev, who had already put in kind of a rough estimation to about $1,000. And there was also sentiment from the call from Ethereum Foundation researcher Ansgar Dietrich, who was also saying that the Ethereum protocol is changing very rapidly and that changes to Kev's EIP, the second EIP, would be needed anyways. So aside from, the changing costs of hardware, aside from the profitability of validators over time, there's also a ton of other major changes coming to the protocol, aka PeerDAS, say EPVS, so many other code changes that are still in the works for Ethereum. And that's also why the chair of the call this week, Alex Stokes, also an Ethereum Foundation researcher, I believe now he actually leads the research and development teams of Ethereum. Alex was saying that rather than spend more time discussing every single detail of Kev's EIP, of this informational EIP, he was like, oh, well, let's just not spend too much time on it because we'll have to update it anyways. And it'll probably be an EIP that will have to change as Ethereum changes. And one of the things I want to say about this EIP, it's about to be finalized. It's a very official document that now will be part of the official Ethereum EIP repo. And clearly, it is a document that will be lacking in some ways and will require frequent updates. I do think that this EIP still calls and leaves and should leave a lot of room for more research to be done on the hardware and bandwidth requirements of validators. One of the takeaways from the prior episode, again, that I had mentioned earlier in this episode with Nixo and Yorick, is that these validator hardware requirements and measuring them, there's so many methodologies to go about doing it. The more that the ecosystem doesn't just rely on this one EIP for the canonical information about what it takes to run an Ethereum validator, I think the better. I do think that there should be more documents on this topic, and there should be more research done on it from multiple sources. And I do also have a little bit of a skepticism about how frequently and how on top of updating this document developers will be. To be quite clear, Ethereum protocol developers have a lot on their plate. They have quite a bit of work, not only when it comes to planning these upgrades, but around governance and maintaining the Ethereum protocol and coming out with new client releases. Protocol developers and all of the ambitious technical kind of changes they want to make to Ethereum, updating this EIP, say every quarter and keeping the information up to date is perhaps one of those responsibilities that I don't know how much it makes sense falls into the hands of Ethereum protocol developers. But for now, that's what developers say that they're going to do. And this EIP is, Alex emphasized that this EIP should be finalized in a week's time. But even so, I maintain that that the information in this EIP should be taken with a grain of salt, and that more analysis and more research on this topic should be done, and it should come from multiple sources. And especially, I think it would be very interesting to see the results of the differences in the results that come out, and the cadence of, I think, like updating it and seeing how it changes over time from not just the Ethereum protocol developers, but particularly Ethereum node operators, major Ethereum blockchain infrastructure providers, node operators, even from staking pools like Lido. I think there's still a huge opportunity for this kind of information to be shared, and for this information to be iterated on over time. So these are the two EIPs that have been finalized this week, and for the latter, the second one that I just talked about, again, it is likely now. It's in the very final call for comments, but it should by no means again be the only document that is out there for understanding the minimum requirements for validator hardware and bandwidth. This was a little bit of a shorter episode for the Infinite Jungle, but that is also because the ACD call, the most recent ACD call, was also short. So there wasn't too much to discuss. That said, I hope that all of my listeners enjoyed the episode and learned something new about Ethereum. I am signing off from San Francisco, actually, this week, not from the concrete jungle of New York City. Please stay tuned for the new Infinite Jungle episode that is coming out tomorrow. That is a pretty cool episode featuring Giulio Rebuffo, the CTO of Aragon, an execution layer client on Ethereum. And it is Giulio's podcast debut. He told me that he hasn't done, formal podcast interviews before. And he's also 22 years old, very young, but he has had such a big impact in the Ethereum space, in the Ethereum ecosystem. So stay tuned for that episode. And thank you again for listening. In your explorations of the infinite jungle that is Ethereum, stay safe out there.